Hey everybody, welcome back to the Live Life Simple Kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to take some of your acorn squash harvest from last year and turn it into a tasty meal that we can freeze dry. If you're like me, you always have a lot of squash left over from last year, but I like growing squash because it's so easy to grow and it stores really well over the winter time. But you kind of get to the point where you don't know what to do with certain things like squash. And squash by itself is usually pretty plain in my opinion, unless you just slather it with butter or maple syrup or something like that. But we're gonna take some things that pair really well with the acorn squash, but they're not unhealthy. This actually just happens to be a really healthy recipe and it's very filling as well. First thing I'm gonna do is preheat my oven to 400 degrees. You want to line a baking sheet with some parchment paper. You want to snap off all of the stems on top of these squash. Then you're going to cut the squash lengthwise right down the center. And you want to make sure that your seeds are not super slimy, and you want to make sure there's no mold inside, just to make sure that it was stored properly and then it's not bad. You want to take a spoon, we're just going to carve out all of that stuff on the inside. Today I'm doing 3 acorn squash for my recipe. You can adjust your recipe for whatever your needs are, whatever size freeze dryer you have. This next step can be another thing that can be a little bit tricky. Typically when you bake squash, you oil this cut side and then put it face down. I am not gonna do any oil. I want these to store as long as we can get away with, so I'm not gonna do any oil. We're gonna put these in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes. Next, we're gonna brown a half of cup of Panko breadcrumbs. And this can be a little tricky trying to do this without oil. You can lightly oil if you choose to do so. We're gonna put this in its own bowl. We're gonna set it aside. We're gonna add about a tablespoon of parsley, preferably fresh parsley. If you don't have it, you can use the dry stuff, and then just a little bit of garlic salt. We're gonna take a little bit of vegetable broth. I like to use vegetable broth to saute in because we can't use oil. We're gonna add 5 to 6 ounces of mushrooms and then 2/3 of a cup of onion. We're gonna cook these for about 5 to 6 minutes. If you're using freeze-dried garlic, then I would add that before our 5 or 6 minutes are up so it can have time to rehydrate. Next, we're gonna go in with some kale and 1 clove of garlic. Then we're gonna take 3 cups of chopped kale, not cooked kale, and we're gonna cook the kale until it wilts, which pretty much just means that it's kind of pliable. We're gonna transfer that mixture to a mixing bowl. We're gonna add 2/3 of a cup of raisins or currants, 1/4 of a cup of soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of sherry vinegar or rice vinegar. This also calls for just a little bit of honey, and I know what you're thinking, you probably don't want to use honey, but we're gonna see if this survives the freeze dry. And then very last, we're gonna put in 2 to 2.5 cups of our cooked wild rice. And our squash should be done. If you take a fork, you should be able to poke all the way through it pretty easily. It should be nice and soft. Mine looks like it's done. I'm gonna go ahead and take it out. And even with no oil, these should be really nice. And then we're gonna take our rice mixture and fill the cavity of all of this squash. And then we're gonna hit the top of these with our breadcrumbs mixture. And that ends up being my favorite part on these. These are gonna go back into the oven. You just wanna make sure that you do not overcook them. You just want the squash to be cooked all the way through. So I will probably just put mine in for 5-10 minutes, depending on the size of the squash and a few other things. It could be 20 to 25 minutes, maybe even more. Just want that squash all the way cooked all the way through. All right, those are looking pretty darn delicious. I think what we want to do is separate these skins from the squash. Try not to make a giant mess out of it, and then we're going to transfer it onto the freeze drying tray. If you were not freeze drying this, obviously you would just keep it like this, and this would be 1 serving for a person. You just use the acorn squash as a bowl. And if your squash is all the way done, it should if you take a fork and just kind of carve out around like you would an avocado or something, you can usually get this out in just about one piece. And then I think if you flip this over, you kind of want to keep all of these, all of the inside, the good stuff, you kind of want to keep that all evenly spread through here. So if you don't make portions, you kind of have everything evenly spread into a serving. So 2 squash fit on a large tray, or 4 halves. And I think just for kicks, I'm going to throw in the dividers just to see if these will stay together when they're freeze drying. And then that'll kind of divvy it up into servings as well. I took 2 of the longs out, and then so 2 of these squares would be a half of an acorn squash. And then these are ready for the deep freeze. All right, well, I ended up doing a couple trays of squash, and then I'm gonna add a few other things in with it. Nothing crazy, so it shouldn't affect the cycle time a whole lot. But we have nice equal portions all frozen together. And take a second to subscribe to Live Life Simple if you have not already. We do primarily freeze drying and things similar to that on this channel. And as always, if you found the video helpful or our content helpful, make sure you give us a thumbs up. It really helps out with the YouTube algorithm. Helps these videos get out to freeze dryers and people who may be interested in freeze drying. And if you're curious about freeze drying, check out our Facebook group and our MeWe group. We try and do weekly giveaways, sometimes monthly giveaways. I know we've gotten a little bit lax on that. We've had a lot of stuff going on lately. Those will be coming up soon though. And on those groups you can find answers to almost any question you can think of. Just use this little magnifying glass. Once you get there, you can search old threads. You'll also find lots of like-minded individuals in there ready to share information, sharing recipes, tips, tricks, etc. And if you're curious about freeze drying, you can follow our affiliate link. I will put a link down in the description below. That will take you to Harvest Right's website. Let them know that we sent you, and the commissions we make from that we put back into the freeze drying community. It helps us maintain our social media groups, helps us with those giveaways, and also helps us develop our products that you've seen in this video. And if you want any of those products, you can go to freezedryingsupplies.com. There you can find lids, you can find stackers, you can find our dividers, pre-cut parchment paper, Mylar bags, pretty much anything you can think of for accessories for the freeze dryer. Also, one last thing, if you want to be able to watch your freeze dryer 24/7 on your phone while you're at work, in the middle of the night, whatever, check out this Rio link. I'll put a link down there. I did a video on this a couple weeks ago, and I'm really starting to like this thing, so make sure you check that out too. And I think that's all I have for shameless plugs, so let's get back to our acorn squash. All right, in just 38 short hours, we are all done. I'm gonna take my infrared thermometer. We're just gonna do a quick check, make sure there's no cold spots in it. If there are cold spots, it's not all the way done. And so far, it's looking good. We're all room temperature. And now we can tag it and bag it and then put it into our chamber sealer. Well, here's our finished product. Let's take a peek and see what we have, and we'll give it a rehydration and a taste test. Well, I'm really liking the way that this freeze dries. There's no question this will do really well long-term, maximum shelf life for this stuff. And I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised about how good this stuff is. Normally squash to me is very bland, but this is good by itself. It doesn't need any kind of sauce or anything. I'm gonna heat up some hot water. We're gonna add it in. I'm gonna cover it for a few minutes, and then we're gonna give it a taste test. And before we add that water, I'm going to just kind of mash up this stuff into smaller pieces, the stuff that's stuck together. And you'll notice that even though this has raisins and it has a little bit of honey in it, there were no explosions or anything in the freeze dryer, and everything seemed to do just fine. So I guess a little bit of honey when mixed in with some stuff, it seems to do okay. And we should be good now. And this looks just about perfect. You can't tell it's been freeze dried. It has the same exact texture. Let's see how this tastes. And this is a super filling and hearty meal. It all rehydrated really well. Lots of good vitamins, lots of good nutrients in here. Doesn't need any kind of sauce. It's not bland like squash usually is. And really no doubt in my mind this will just be maximum shelf life. I love it. It's awesome. That amount that I just rehydrated was basically half an acorn squash. Those were actually really small acorn squash too, so you might be able to get a little bit more out of a bigger acorn squash, but really good recipe, I think. I think you're gonna like it. It has lots of flavor. In the meantime, this is Retired at 40. Remember to live life simple, and we'll catch you next week.